Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm TJ Pache with Ready for Tuesday. I'm very happy that you're here with us. Before we get started, just a few quick housekeeping notes. We will have time toward the end for audience questions, so please use the Q&A feature to submit those as we go. Today's conversation is recorded. We'll share the recording afterward, and it will be posted to YouTube. Today's webinar, which I'm very, very, very much looking forward to, looks at election data and the people who need it. I think we all know that election officials sit on some of the most requested or viewed data in public life. Reporters need it for stories on deadline. Researchers need it to understand how elections are working. And voters need it to trust and understand the results. That demand is relatively constant, obviously punctuated by the dates of elections. But I think meeting those needs doesn't have to be a burden. Election officials can build habits and systems that make transparency with data the easy path and not the extra one. Our conversation today will take a practical look at what the people requesting election data wish officials knew, what officials can do ahead of time to make being helpful easier, and what good data sharing looks like at every level. I'm very, very excited to have three excellent professionals from different parts of the election space joining us today. We've got Andrew, and Andrew, I made the big mistake of not getting. I shouldn't make this mistake because of my last name. Andrew, can you please tell everybody your last name?
Oh,
Aran?
sure. It's orange, but TJ, I've heard everything over the years, so I you can pronounce it however you want to.
I am so disappointed in myself. Andrew Orange, the Director of Operations for the program on Opinion Research and Election Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Nicholas Martinez, the Executive Vice President for Policy and Analytics at All Voting is Local. And last, but certainly not least, Jessica Signa, the Director of Data Analysis at the small but mighty Rhode Island Department of State. I want to turn it to each of you to give a little bit of an intro about how you interact with election data and what it looks like in your roles. And we'll go in reverse order from how I just said your names and actually start with Jess. So Jess, please tell us about yourself and tell us about your work.
Great. Oh, thanks so much for having me here today. So, as you mentioned, I work at the Rhode Island Department of State, and my role is actually more broad than elections data. I work with all the different divisions of the Secretary of State's office, but most of my time, at least half, is spent with the elections team doing a myriad of things. So, I help manage our public dashboards, and I also help manage our internal and external requests. So our internal storytelling and sort of learning about what we're doing, how we're doing, and how our data works. And then also when folks come to us seeking information. So that's a little bit about my role.
All right, Nicholas.
Thanks, TJ, and thank you for having me here today. Again, Nicholas Martinez with All Voting is Local. I will start by saying I began my career right out of graduate school working in an elections office in North Florida, and my job there was specifically around data for the elections office, doing both tomography and GIS work. And so I grew up really learning what kind of the importance and the value of the data, being able to set up the database, track the data changes we were making, and use that data to kind of learn from as an organization, similar to what you were saying, Jessica. I also did a lot of the public records requests for the office to all the campaigns and individuals who are looking for voter data, academics, and the like. That has been a through line in my career, looking at election data, using it in different ways. I did my PhD work as well at here in Miami at FIU, and I use a lot of election data to put that work together. And what I'll say is, in my work today, we still use data from election administration to really understand the perspective of the voter, what's happening on the voter on the ground, so that we can try and put together a narrative to really paint a picture for what that experience is like, so that we can go back to election officials and say, hey, the data that we see coming from your systems really suggests to us that there's an opportunity to improve, or you're doing a great job over here, or how do we help support you in an effort to get more resources so that we can support the voter. But the data has become now a critical part of that advocacy work and that storytelling so that we can do everything we can to give voters an equal and a very excellent experience from one jurisdiction to the next.
Excellent, Nicholas. All right, Andrew, you probably interact with data that is both the most viewed, but perhaps we know the least about your work specifically. So can you tell us what you do?
Yeah, absolutely, TJ. Thank you again for the invite for this. So I'm Andrew Orange. My full-time job, I work at the University of Pennsylvania, where we study from an academic perspective, right? All of the data that election officials produce across the country, and we teach classes, and we oversee minors, and we do some research and all that kind of stuff. But my team here at Penn is also the team that gets brought in specifically on election nights to do the real-time data analysis work for NBC News and projects the elections on behalf of the news division. So one of my roles on election night, for example, is I'm the guy in our team that specifically helps to support Steve Kornacki and his team while he's on TV. He's the guy, right, that's at the big board clicking around and doing all of that kind of stuff. And so part of our job is to understand what data exists, how to gather it, where it exists in the world. As you all know, American elections are decentralized, and so it looks vastly different in every jurisdiction in the country, how folks think about it. And we do our best with some of our partners at the AP and whatnot, right, to put some structure on that, to gather things in as efficient manner as possible, and then communicate out to the American public where things stand at this moment in time.
Amazing, amazing. All right, well let's jump into questions. And again, we'll leave time at the end for Q&A from the audience. So folks, please use that function if you're here with us live to put questions. I want kind of just a general view about kind of what the demand for election data looks like right now from where each of you sit. I know, for example, we've got an election here in Florida today. We obviously have over the next few months many more elections that are coming up. What does the demand look like? How has that changed over election cycles? I think I want to start with Jess because I imagine the things that folks are asking for today, or at least the quantities of it today, are much different than they were, say, 10 or 20 years ago. How has that affected your work?
That's right. So in Rhode Island, demand is sort of moderate right now and really varies widely. So we are about to have our primary. It's on September 9th. And so we're seeing requests not just from researchers or reporters, but from campaigns, from armchair election data gurus, these people who do this just sort of fun on social media. We're seeing fans, our election enthusiasts and our fan clubs reaching out for information. What's really interesting is that since we have some publicly available tools, our requests really vary widely. So some folks, we just send them the link to the voter registration or some of the older data that came out of the dashboards, and that really satisfies that question. And people are so excited that they get it so quickly, and it's exactly, this is exactly what I want. Thank you. And then sometimes that really opens up more nuanced questions. And so we see people really wanting to drill down into some of the data that we have and sort of how we have it and how we've gotten it. So it's a combination of having a centralized voter registration system that came online in Rhode Island a couple of decades ago, where we're able to really do those things. And we have new reporting tools that come out of that. And then also these sort of dashboards that illuminate the data and are for the most part very public, but then they often engender questions from folks that want a little bit more down the lines. And Nicholas mentioned it. One of the things that we've been getting a lot lately is actually requests for shapefiles and geographic data, which then enables me to have some really interesting conversations about how redistricting works and how precincts change over the time. And just to ensure that people are using the data in the best way that they can.
That's excellent. Nicholas, from where you sit, what does right now look like? I can imagine at your organization, like looking back at election data is a big thing, but as we sit in the timeline, what's going on in your world?
Yeah, TJ, I think the thing to think about is like the umbrella of things that we can cast as election data is pretty broad, right? And so an organization like ours is really focused on election administration, the practice of running the election. So we're looking for data that speaks to, again, what is the experience of the voter? So it's not how many votes did X candidate get versus Y candidate. It's really about how many rejected mail ballots were there, how many people had to cure their ballot. So it's about that procedural stuff. So we as an organization, because we do so much work with local election officials, we understand like there's a time to make the request. So in thinking about from where we sit, we're not really trying to make a lot of demands right now. So like we might have high demands, but we're trying to be judicious about those demands. And we will make, but we still will make requests of data, especially as things become really important in relation to the uh, voter suppression landscape, let's say. And so if there's a lot of discussion about removing citizens from the potential non-citizens from the roll or looking through who's eligible or not, then we're going to make demands for that kind of data. Or if there's discussions about what's going on in the postal service, we're going to start to try and find public sources of that data, but then make some specific ask for the data if it doesn't exist. So as we get closer to elections, you said in the timeline, yes, we do reflect on the elections, right? And we try and do that in those odd years so we can really get into rich conversations with elections officials to try and change things well in advance. But as we're closer to election, we're really working to get data that we can transact on in the moment and say like, hey, we need to protect voters right now who are trying to access the process.
Excellent. All right, Andrew. I know you mentioned being grateful that somebody's covering Alaska for you this evening in their turnout. What does election data look like for you in terms of your role?
Yeah, so we probably define the term narrower than Nick does. I know I've talked with Jess about this. I've been one of those people that have called her up to ask her questions, right, about the data they've put out there. So obviously we really care about result data, right? The election night reporting, like, how many votes have been cast, who got the votes in different races, how many are still to come, right? Like what is still outstanding. Over the past couple of years, we have continued to care more and more about turnout data too, and specifically like the election day turnout piece of this. Just, I hope you talk at some point about the incredible dashboard that you produced for Rhode Island on election day. I know Florida is voting today, so they have a really tremendous dashboard too. But we within the media organizations all kind of changed the math that we're doing for that percent in number after that are on all of our graphics after around the 2018 election. And it used to be percent of precincts reporting, and now it's percent of expected vote. And so we've poured a lot of resources and effort into trying to understand and essentially project out how many people we think are going to vote in an election before we get the polls closed and before we put that number on television or on our website, right? And so trying to understand who knows what piece of information where and trying to efficiently gather that as best as we can to make sense of it has been the other kind of piece of this that we think about a lot as well. But I'll just say like over the years, I think I've been in this role for about give or take a decade at this point, and our need for more granular data and kind of data that's more needed kind of at a faster pace has just ebbed and flowed a lot as well. The other just kind of big change for you all on this call that you may not have caught yet is so after the 2016 election, the NBC, ABC, CBS, and CNN all kind of went in one direction as part of the national election poll and ended up working with Edison Research. The Associated Press and Fox kind of went a different direction and did kind of their own thing. As of this cycle, we're all back together under the same roof. And so we're all working with the Associated Press now. And so if you have folks that show up to your offices, well, we should at least no longer see folks from Edison Research as a vote reporter there on the ground going forward.
Excellent, excellent. I'm actually going to come back to you, Andrew, because I'm thinking about that relationship between newsrooms, kind of intermediaries like yourself, and election officials. You mentioned that Jess and Rhode Island have a really excellent dashboard that makes things a little bit easier in terms of getting information. But in terms of what information newsrooms need or want from election officials, and maybe even some of the mechanisms through which they get that information, what are some good strategies? What's kind of the ideal? Maybe we don't have to point to Jess as the ideal because that's very obvious, but what are the things that election officials can be doing to make that easier?
Yeah, so I think our needs, similar to Elio's, right, like just change over time. And so I would echo what Nick and Jess were saying about shape files, right? Like when things get redistricted, we really want to know what are the new districts, right? And making sure that we have the right shape files in our system, both for congressional districts, but even at the precinct level, more and more we're doing some analysis work at the precinct level when the data is made available. And so us then knowing kind of being able to compare the past shapefiles to the new shapefiles to understand how to map in the past data becomes really helpful. So making that stuff easily accessible on your website in a predictable place, easily findable, right, is really helpful. That's something that, election officials can do way before the election. One thing that would be really helpful on my end that I know might be slightly challenging to do on election officials' end, but we are a big fan of offices that are able to post about a week or so ahead of time their zero report, which is essentially just like wherever they're going to be posting election results, what the report is going to look like. Because it allows, with just all zeros, like the structure of the report, but all the vote results are just all zeros, right? Because it allows us then to plan ahead of time, one, to know where to look for the data, but two, to also make sure that like all of our systems are good to go and we've accounted for all of the nuances of the way that election officials may have named an office or the way that maybe there are multiple people, like tonight in Alaska, there's two Dan Sullivans running, right? And so just accounting for those pieces of things and making sure that everything is mapped to the right place on our end. And so the sooner that we can see some of that stuff, the better it is, right, for us to just be able to plan accordingly. I know there's some election officials that don't launch that until the day or on the day of election or the day before election. Some people never launch it. It's one of those things that it becomes really, really helpful for us. And then the only other big thing I would flag too is there are some larger jurisdictions that have gotten into this habit, and I find it really helpful to just publish like here's what to expect when, right? Like we will be releasing this data around this time and this data around this time, or it's going to take this amount of time for this and that to happen. Just kind of helps to level set on my end, like expectations of like when we're going to see things. And that allows me to then level set for my entire team and the entire news organization. Like this is about when things are going to happen. As I often tell election officials, I'm not holding you to any time that you tell me, right? But like it just allows us to like try to plan accordingly, so that particularly on a big night when there are a lot of moving pieces, we can try to map everything out accordingly as to like when something may end up happening, so we have the right people in the right places looking at the right screens at that moment in time.
All right. Jess, in the other direction, what is it that you wish news organizations and other organizations kind of understood about the election officials' timeline and capabilities as it relates to getting data out, whatever data that might be?
Great. So we, in our office, the information is sort of bifurcated. So our Department of State handles sort of turnout information and sort of everything before Election Day, and then things on Election Day or what our Board of Elections takes over. But very similar to what Andrew is saying, sort of the we wish we understood people that there's sort of humans behind this. And even though the data are automated and there's sort of these like fancy dashboards and tools, that it is people behind this doing work. And it's sort of the through line through it all, right? So like there's humans are the ones who are entering the voter reg data. And so that comes with a lot of nuance and a lot of information. The data behind it are people, right? It's about voters and it's about that. And then when we're building the data and we're getting it all ready to go, it's a human behind the process, sort of making sure that data is right and accurate. And that takes time and energy and effort. So just a little bit of grace, I guess, is what I wish folks knew. And Andrew and I have a really good working relationship with this, where it's there's an opportunity to have a conversation with folks. And so just that connection is really important. And then I think most people like myself are really willing to sort of talk about the foibles or when things might not align and why. So I just wish folks would, understand that it comes with a lot of nuance and a lot of but latitude to talk with folks in those positions. It's always important to have that like really open line of communication.
Excellent, excellent. Right, I'm going to look to Nick specifically here because I think Andrew mentioned, Nick, that you have kind of a wider view of what election data is because of the nature of the work that you do. So as it relates to when you or your team goes and looks for election data, where do you find kind of the biggest gaps? Is it, I imagine it's not necessarily in results and things like that. I know we've mentioned shape files, but what is it that you often find yourselves looking for that is maybe harder than it should be?
Mm.
Yeah, again, having done this work for over 20 years now, I'll start by saying the amount of data that's available now versus when I started is incredible. It is incredibly different, and it is so rewarding to see more and more states and jurisdictions release information. So more often than not, we are able to find what we're looking for either at the state level or on a county's website itself, or to call them up and say, "Hey, do you have this?" And then they can just make it available pretty quickly. Um, what I will say is we have been experiencing more of a there are just certain aspects of the action of voting that there isn't really a good data capture point. So say, how long are people waiting in line? Like, it'd be great if I could get a report from every state and say in any jurisdiction, here's polling locations, here's how long people have stood in line, and that data becomes more valuable for us because many states have passed line warming laws where you can't interact with voters who are in line. So as voter protection uh, organizations, we're concerned about voters, and I'm from Florida. Standing in the heat to wait in the multiple hour lines is a problem, or Jess in Rhode Island, right? Standing in the cold winter environment. Anything lower than 70 degrees for me is cold winter environment. So I would be uncomfortable standing in line for a long time. So that to me is like a gap. That kind of like, how do we understand more about what it really means to go through the experience of voting, and data that can speak to that, but how do we get good capture points to even be able to get data that we would believe in? I think that's a big gap.
All right, all right. Uh, Jess, you mentioned that Rhode Island has invested, and I'll put them in the chat, but has invested in public dashboards that are kind of proactively putting data out before anyone asks, or at least putting it out so that folks know where to go to get them. Can you talk a little bit about what inspired your office to create those? And like what goes into actually, building them, maintaining them, keeping them alive, et cetera, et cetera.
That's right. They are living, breathing things. Uh, so my position was created in 2019, and I'm the first person to hold it under former Secretary Gorbea. And she had this mission to take as like a way to increase transparency in the office was to take data out of the so-called filing cabinet of the secretary's office and sort of make it public and make it into these more usable formats in lots of different ways. This has only flourished under the new secretary, Secretary Morey. I went to all of the different departments, divisions at the department, and chatted with the directors and said, what is really important for you for storytelling? What's going to help you sort of reduce requests? And that's sort of how these dashboards were born, really about taking that data that was initially sort of static, overwritten, no historical record of it, which is what was happening with some of the voter registration visualizations. Rob Rock had these on our website, but they were overwritten each month. And so that sort of data just was sort of lost to history. And so one of the things that we worked on first was this voter registration dashboard that is a historical look back. So it takes everything from July 2018 and sort of moving forward. It drills down to precinct levels. You can sort of slice and dice it by different districts and political parties and some other things. And really what it took to build that was a lot of teamwork, obviously, here in the division. I actually learned how to use Power BI through this process and sort of learned how to build these dashboards. So it wasn't something that I came and learned knowing a lot about data, but not necessarily how to build these sort of user interfaces like this. And working with our IT team, working with the elections team, we reached out to sort of kind but really great external partners to help us sort of beta test these and figure out what worked, what didn't work. And we came up with a couple of good designs to move forward. One of the things that happened recently, CEIR did a report on our voter registration dashboard. You can read that on their website. It tells like a really in-depth story about the sort of the long-term process and sort of the steps that people can take to do that. And all of these other dashboards that I've listed here sort of came out the similar need over time, where we were gaining more tools, learning how to like increase data during redistricting. I created this district downloader tool that has the shapefiles on it. So whenever anyone asks, we say, here you go, this exists. You can download it. Looking at any PDF of a district, you can just simply look at the map. So just really trying to anticipate what people want based on questions that we've had in the past. Frankly, this turnout tool, it's actually available live right now. I've been updating it. We have our mail ballot tracker is already up. Was a similar situation where we discovered with our electronic poll books that we did have access to this sort of like timely data where you can download it and sort of build all these really interesting graphics that help tell the story and really help reduce the questions, the text messages, the emails, the phone calls to the offices and frankly to all the different local election officials across the state, reducing those types of questions because folks can just sort of shift right to that tool.
That's excellent. A moment of brevity. I would love if Rhode Island would put up a dashboard that has all of the fan mail and love letters that Deputy Secretary Rob Rock receives. I know he gets it because I send so much of it, but I think that'd be really cool. Nicholas and Andrew, I know that you all also create dashboards for your own purposes within your organizations or for news organizations. Can you talk a little bit about kind of what that process looks like? What information you found to be most helpful in terms of getting info to folks who need it? Start with Andrew.
Yeah, I think so. On our end, we obviously build a bunch of tools that are public facing. We have some tools that are internal facing. I would say on my end, it really behooves us to understand what the data is actually representing and what is potentially being measured and what's not being measured. So I spend a ton of time trying to understand. So go to the poll book example that just showed, right? Like you can get poll book data if you call the right person, but sometimes in different offices or some people share it. But one of the things that's not often shared is like if a poll book is offline, right? So then the number that like you're actually looking at is actually not representative of what you might be interpreting it as to represent, right? So it's trying to understand all of those like gaps of like understanding how different folks have set up their systems so that there was a county at one point where I called them on election day and I was like, oh, you had this many people vote today. And the PR person said, where'd you get that number? And I was like, it's on your website. And he said, oh, don't believe that number. And I said, what do you mean don't believe that number? He said, and it took me a while to figure out what was happening, but essentially their poll books, I think of poll books as like a central place is pulling the data from all of the poll books simultaneously. And the way they have set up their poll books is that each poll book has the ability to push individually the data to the centralized thing. But those setups are actually really importantly and really different, right? Because if everybody has the ability to push, then that means nothing is on the exact same time schedule. And so the number from one poll book is not exactly the same timestamp as a number from another poll book. And so it's like this level of nuance that I spend a lot of time trying to wrap my head around, just because my biggest fear is that you all as election officials have communicated something out there that then for whatever reason, I or the folks that do the work that I do, we misinterpret it. And it's
Yeah.
through that moment of just like it being posted and us not having the time to just like double check and ask all of the follow-up questions that something gets missed. And so the one big thing that I would love for everybody to do if possible is that when you're creating data to put a timestamp against it, like when was it true? And even like, and this may be hard to do, but like, is every number in there true at that timestamp? Or did like different numbers get updated at different times? And if so, then I would make the argument, and this may be hard, but like put a timestamp next to every number just so that I know, for example, like when was it last updated? And like, can I actually trust what's there? Because that's, I think, like the biggest thing that I think about from just the pipeline of us then taking it and making sure that then when we create a dashboard or we share it with somebody or whatnot, we are not putting meaning on there that's not actually there, and we're being truthful to what is actually being communicated and what's being represented.
Excellent. Andrew, that's two things that you've said. If I could have everybody do just one thing,
I
it would,
know, I'm sorry,
we'll have
TJ.
to keep track of how many we get to at the end.
I have a lot of requests. I'm sorry, man.
I actually have a horror story about something that Andrew is talking about that I can share. Is that I now use Google Data Studio for our turnout tracker, and that's because that allows me to do some changes instantaneously. It's just the tools that I have access to, and what we work with here. But originally, when I built the turnout tracker, I was using Power BI, and we went live. We were supposed to do it every hour. And I made the changes. I pressed go. I pressed publish to web. Behind the scenes, it made the changes. On our website, it changed one number, but it didn't change the rest. And then a few minutes later, it changed another number, but it didn't change the rest. And we actually got calls from the press, and I was horrified, that sick feeling. And it was. Even though we tested, for whatever reason, it just didn't work on go live day. And so, yeah, it's really important to have, as Andrew's saying, that knowledge of when are things timestamped, what is real, and sort of know when you might have failures.
Yeah, I think if there are any election officials on the call or on the webinar who have not familiarized themselves with that sick feeling, then it's just a matter of several more elections before they're introduced to it. And Nicholas, thinking about your work, thinking about dashboards, public or otherwise, what's that process look like for you?
Yeah, just to double back on what both Andrew and Jessica are talking about, like having my own flashbacks of having done the work, right? Like it really, an election is an organic thing until like it ain't over till it's over. Until we've closed it, like yes, everything is in flux, and a lot of things can change. I will say from our perspective, we do a lot. Again, we do a lot of in retrospect,
Yeah.
unless we're really focused on a thing like hey, early voting feels like it's really exploding, and there's a lot of people going to early voting, and are those places overwhelmed, right? In those certain locations, and many jurisdictions doing an excellent job of releasing that data now. They say like, hey, here's how many people are going to different facilities in our jurisdiction. Um, One of the things that we use and that we create for internal dashboards is the ease data from the EAC. And so for all the elections folks who are on the call, like thank you for doing the work to fill out the EAC. I think it's a call the survey. It's really not a survey. It's really kind of an audit. And it is very useful for organizations like ours to be able to at least speak a common language. And so what we, with elections officials, say, hey, this is the number that was out there. We are now post-election. So that's squishiness in terms of, things that are happening in flux and in motion. Andrew has a different kind of like requirement because he needs, there's a timeliness, but we're trying to take some of that data as like, this is now post-election, it's as factual as we can get, even though definitions can change. And so we try and take a very kind of measured approach to the internal data tools that we build so that we can have honest conversations where we're not trying to overplay a hand, or we're not trying to use the data in a punitive way. I will say we do mix a lot of that data with census data. We have a civil rights background, and so we're also looking at the specific groups in terms of how their experiences from one jurisdiction to the next might be, again, different or similar. And so we create our dashboards to kind of reflect that kind of bigger picture thinking. But we don't have, again, we don't have that like level of high intense pressure necessarily in the moment. We do things that are timely, definitely, but not in the same way I think Andrew is kind of positioned.
Absolutely, absolutely. All right, I'm thinking now about I love the point that anything that anybody's doing really until the election is over is just a snapshot. And I think that that's a really important point. As I have seen as kind of election official data operations have become more sophisticated, folks have made really good efforts to be more transparent by communicating information that is still in flux. So, for example, I know Florida, many of the supervisors of elections now put on their websites the number of outstanding mail ballots that they have so that the public can kind of have an understanding of here's where we are right now, here's where we can expect to be as this process continues. So just thinking about the act or the art of communicating data while not divorcing it from its context. Any good strategies or practices that folks can be thinking about there? Maybe start with Andrew. Andrew, you're nodding. I'll go to
Yeah,
you.
well, so one of the things that I was shocked to learn when I dug into this world, TJ, right, is that the like precincts in number that's on a lot of people's reports, right? That kind of is like this measurement of progress. Well, in some jurisdictions in the country, that number ticks up when all of the votes in a precinct are in. And in other jurisdictions in the country, that number ticks up once any vote in that precinct is in. And those are not right? But are being presented as potentially the same thing, right? And so I would ask election officials, right, to kind of go back and maybe ask your data folks or ask your IT folks, like, how does it work in your jurisdiction? And are we potentially communicating out a level of doneness, right? That like a precinct is done when actually you're simply measuring a representation, right, in that moment. I'm a big fan of on a lot of ENR reports, folks have the ability to put like a note at the top of it and really appreciate, for example, like when folks just say, election officials say, like, this has been reported, this has been reported, this is still to come, right? Like just indicating for us, like what is still outstanding. We just did Wisconsin last week, and so the county of Milwaukee has a really phenomenal like website where they have just like all the jurisdictions, and you can actually it'll change like when they have updated, and they literally in their conference room or whatever like have a physical version of it as well, and they go and they put like a new a thing on the screen to say like this town is reported or this town is reported or and it's finalized and that kind of stuff. Um, but I think but putting this information in the same place every election and also kind of in a place where we will be able to easily find it becomes really important. One just story here from Pennsylvania. After the 20, I don't know, after I think 2022 it was, we introduced something called Act 88, where by midnight, every election, the election officials have to put on their website how many outstanding mail ballots are out there. Turns out every county here in the Commonwealth put the data in different places, use different language for it, but also they usually put it in the same place election to election, but there's no way to know an easy way to know whether or not they updated their website that evening. And so one of the just like workarounds that my team has figured out is like I'll literally assign somebody on election night at 8 o'clock when polls close here in Pennsylvania to go take a screenshot of every website so we know what it looked like at 8 o'clock, so that then we can compare it back to that screenshot at midnight to see whether or not that data changed or not, so that we know that we're looking at updated and accurate information.
Excellent. Jess, anything on this question?
I was going to say that it helps, and I think it's in a similar vein of what Andrew's talking about, is to sort of understand your processes and sort of how the work happens in reports. It sounds like pretty like a dull task, but honestly, I think as probably many of us can understand, it actually uncovers sort of the hidden sort of what actually is happening to the data, and do we think we actually have the universe that we intend to have when we're looking at the sort of different processes and sort of the way that things are being pulled. A lot of times we aren't the ones who created the reports, right? We inherited them, or we inherited these processes. And so we sometimes make assumptions, and we know what happens sometimes with that. So even though it's like a really dull thing, I often just, it's really helpful to sort of step by step by step, what are the process and what are sort of what happens along the way, and sort of who gets added in and who is removed.
All right. I'm thinking about, I used to work with a guy who, whenever we would put something out, we would just put it out as a PDF. I mean, obviously, we could have put it out as an Excel file. It was just one button over. And his approach, which is, probably not an uncommon one for better or worse, was no, we'll do a PDF. We're not going to make this easy for people. Can you all describe, and maybe we'll start with Nicholas, can you all describe some practices on that front? And it seems like kind of benign differences, but some practices on that front that make it easier to be consumers of election data in all of their forms?
I will be very transparent here. So I've worked on both sides of the desk, right? So I've worked in government, and I've worked now both in the private sector and in nonprofits. And if I, as a data consumer today, get from an organization a PDF, and that's alongside a CSV on their same website, or a scanned PDF that is an image that is not OCR readable, like, I know exactly what they're trying to do. Like, it doesn't fool anyone, right? And so when we see data people who have dealt with the systems that everyone's talking about, know how to configure them to output certain ways. And so when we see it, we go, there's a different way to get this, and I know you can get it. So either, like, we're going to do this the hard way, and I have to go get a FOIA request and get my lawyers involved, or we could just, like, can we have a conversation? And so when I see that, like, it sends signals to the people who are consumers of the data of how transparent an organization is trying to be. And then what it inadvertently does, it sends a negative signal that you're trying to hide something, right? And I think that, and look, this is not just elections, folks, in specific. We did a project recently, in the last couple of years, around the county budgets and the budgets that were allocated to elections. And the budget offices for the counties were actually worse than anyone I've ever dealt with. Like, they would literally taking scanned copies of a 300-page budget book, and you couldn't search any of it. You couldn't look for anything. And we're just trying to find, where did you allocate money for the elections office, right? And so, like, good data also, again, good data practice also is works to the benefit of the election official on other aspects of the kind of the entire universe. And so if we want to go and help advocate for the elections department to get more money, well, we need data to explain how well they're funded versus the parks department or something else in the jurisdiction.
Jess, I will take my Rob Rock request as PDFs. It's perfectly okay. But just thinking about Nicholas's answer, I'm not hoping for a rebuttal, but what you got?
Actually, it's really interesting. So I've received some pretty fair feedback that the dashboards are the new PDF, and that people are putting up these dashboards and saying, oh, here, our data is transparent, it's public. But in fact, if I'm being honest, while our turnout tracker dashboard is actually downloadable, and you can thank Andrew for that. Actually, he was the first person to ask me to do that. Our Power BI dashboards, just by nature of having the government version of Power BI, I cannot make that downloadable. So if anybody wants that data in an Excel file, in a CSV, they have to come back to us and ask. And I think that's a pretty fair criticism of dashboards, where people are saying, oh, it's in a dashboard, you can go get it. Well, someone still might have to scrape it because it's still not downloadable. So it's going to help some groups, but maybe a researcher, maybe people who are more sophisticated users will still need it. So one of the things that I'm actually doing is working on a redesign where I'm going to have that link to the raw file just there as well. And that way people can go and get that when I have my power users who are really interested in the more raw data. So I do think it's a fair criticism, and it's very similar to the same thing. People are going to take a screenshot of all the different pieces of the dashboard if they want it.
All right, very good. Andrew, anything? I know we're going to move into Q&A, but anything to add there?
I would just say consistent format is really helpful. Machine readable is really helpful. I think one of the things that I discovered with my frustration that Nicholas was talking about with the printed of a PDF was the discovery talking to some local election officials, right? That because their results are not in any way connected to the internet, like the way that they share the results is they physically print them out, right? And then they scan in that PDF. And so just on my end, understanding the fact that like it is their process as a way to try and keep everything secure and not necessarily right like trying to make my life more complicated, right, was slightly helpful to understand, especially in that the after a long day of right like them trying to administer the election and that piece of this as well. And so I think on my end it's been helpful to then talk to folks that are actually responsible for producing some of this stuff to just understand what are the decision points right that they have. But I will say I often will talk to election officials about, well, can you do the version of the report that's like the summary group detail or the like just to try and like it's an additional maybe click or whatnot on their end, but the more granularity that we can get on our end, the things we just appreciate that level of stuff. And I think sometimes election officials haven't quite thought through how those of us in the media or those researchers or whatnot are going to use the data and why that extra like level of granularity is really, really helpful as well.
All right, amazing. Well, let's move into the Q&A. Let's see here. We've got several questions. One person would like the chat to be made or to be saved and shared later. Happy to do that. This one's for you, Andrew. How do you propose best communication practices for communicating procedural nuances within data?
Yeah, so I think so. Some of the larger jurisdictions do a really good job. Los Angeles comes to mind, where they put out like a media briefing book or media PDF ahead of time that really go through like, here's what you're going to see, here's the time you're going to see it, here's what it means, here's what it doesn't mean, here's what's to come after the election day. I think on like California's side of things, like they do a really good job. I know a week ahead of time, like how many days they're going to be counting for after the fact. I know the exact hour generally, like when they're going to be reporting data. It just becomes like this predictability thing. I think there's this balance between, I think, like getting too in the weeds and not getting in the weeds enough, right? So that folks understand it. I try to credit myself with like understanding the nuances of all this that I can like, I try my best to be able to speak y'all's language, right? And like get into the nuances of like, I understand the difference between art and ES&S and we can talk about the fact that Clarity rebranded to SEO, right? And like anyway, right? Like or the Silo folks rebranded SEO and can kind of try to speak y'all's language so that we understand it to the best of our ability. But I also say that like I'm one person at one organization, and I know I have friends that do similar work at AP, and there's some at the other organizations, but like not everybody is in this level of nuance. But I would prefer, right, like more information than less. As I try to tell election officials, like one of my jobs internally is to be your advocate and your voice so that I can level set with everybody as to like this is the process and this is how it works in their jurisdiction and this is why. And that's okay, right? Like the when the Milwaukee had its issues last week where they had to go back, right, to rerun the download the data onto the flash drives, right, to resave the central count data. Like it was my job to then explain to everybody internally, like this is okay. It's going to take time. It's going to take them 20 minutes to drive to back to go get the data and like lay out the expectations and just kind of normalize the fact that like this is how elections work and it works differently in different jurisdictions. But as you can all imagine, right, like it is a hard job, right, to try and understand how everybody thinks about this stuff locally.
All right, excellent, excellent. Uh, Jess or Nicholas, anything to add on that front? All right. Well, let's move. I've got it's a long question. I'm going to try to paraphrase it, likely unsuccessfully. This person is talking about how so much focus is on getting contests called on election night, especially I think Andrew, obviously with organizations or efforts like your own. This person is asking, kind of within Jess's wheelhouse, why don't states do more to compile granular data. So, for example, they mention being able to compare turnout by age, for example, and kind of a comprehensive data look back at how an election went. They're talking at the state level, but you can imagine doing something similar at the local level. So their question is, shouldn't we be trying to get all state election officials to compile this kind of data after every election? Jess?
Yeah, so we actually do that. I have in our historic turnout, I actually don't do it by age, I do it by generation, because that way you always know I'm Gen X, right? So Gen X, I know how Gen X is going to vote every time versus how to 18 to 20-year-olds vote. 18, 20-year-olds are sort of always rolling. Um, but I think this is a fair question. One of the things that I really struggle with when I put together this report is that it doesn't neatly match what the results are because of so many things, right? So I'm looking at turnout data. So how many people logged into a poll book, how many people returned a mail ballot versus what the actual results were. And as we know, we're in a very fraught election environment. And so it's sort of nerve inducing to say, well,
Yep.
this is the percentage or these are the counts of people in each group. And then automatically it's, well, why does not match turnout? And it's great that it doesn't match turnout because we know things are divorced and we know that that's really important that the vote is hidden and shielded. But at the same time, sometimes it's really complicated to explain why those differences exist to reporters, even to people who have been doing this for a long time. So I'm definitely an advocate for sharing that information. The other piece that is a challenge in Rhode Island, and I'm sure it is in other places, is that it just takes some time to get that data into the system. We are top down, but we rely on each of our municipalities, our 39 municipalities, like you said, small but mighty, to have their own data in, right? We manage the system, but everyone puts the data in, and those come in at all sort of varying times. And so there's just a lot of the word is cleaning, right? We know that that exists. And it's not that I'm trying to change the data or scrub the data. It's just that things don't make sense. And so I just have to kind of go back and understand why those are
Yep.
differences. So I am a fan of this. I think it's important. I can see the trends going back several elections, and that data is available. Anyone can go to vote.ri.gov right now and look at generational voting over the past several elections. But I just would urge caution. And again, that word, that grace, right? To understand that there's going to be differences in how, what the numerator and denominator are. It's not ever going to match that. And we just have to be really comfortable in that level of uncomfortability.
Yeah, you mentioned the example of, I mean, somebody checks in at an e-poll book and then for whatever reason decides not to cast a ballot. Like that makes it one difference. You multiply that across 39 or 400 jurisdictions, and obviously the number multiplies alongside it. Same thing with mail ballots, where I think every election official has sliced open a mail ballot while processing it and found there is nothing in the envelope. So
Yes.
what are you to do with that? Nicholas, on this one, thinking kind of that I think a lot of your work or a lot of the work similar to your work kind of does just this in terms of telling that story of the election within different states, getting down to some of that more granular data. Any advice for election officials who may want to start proactively doing that?
Yeah, I Jessica actually mentioned this earlier. It's like publishing raw data is really beneficial, right? So as close as we can get to the source, and I understand this this particular circumstance, like yeah, there's a you don't want to release that data necessarily until you have really closed the books, and so that is because where we stand in the timeline, like the most important thing is what votes were cast for whom and who won the contest, and then the kind of shortly there following after is like who actually participated in the election and how did they vote, like the vote method. Coming from the state of Florida, that data is very available and it's very easy to get, and has been for years. But the thing I wanted to say is kind of also a response to an earlier question is we're talking a lot about, and again, we're in a moment in time, we're so close to the election, we're thinking a lot about like data about this election happening right now, people voting in the process. To me, there's less attention and interest around things like list maintenance and the data that comes out from a list maintenance, which is earlier in the year, right? And like I want granularity there, right? I want to know who was removed from the roll. What notices were they sent? Send me a picture of those notices. I would love for elections officials to be more transparent at that, at more of the stages of the process, not when the spotlights are the heaviest, right? And there is a lot of data confusion that comes through, and some of the questions here we saw like how do you communicate like data dictionaries are really important, or having some type of document that explains to me what your codes really mean. I don't want to have to go back to you and ask. I don't want to have to try and like based on my experience of having set up these databases in the past, I think a C means this and a B means this. Like, well, maybe, but there's totally different systems and totally different designs and totally different perspectives from different jurisdictions. So um, the granularity for me is a like a through line from one part of the election to another part of the election, and all of it really matters in able and if we are trying to be able to speak specifically to how well was an election administered and how well were the voters treated as they go through the process.
Excellent, excellent. Well, we are almost at the end, so I'm actually gonna ask one question of each of you, which is if I'm a state or local election official, just again thinking about our audience for these webinars, but I'm a state or local election official, and I want to do one thing this election cycle that's going to be helpful as it relates to the data that I'm putting out to my different stakeholders and voters and so forth. What, I mean, Andrew, this will be your third thing. So if everybody else gets their one thing, you get three. But what is that one thing, starting with Nicholas?
What is the one thing? And I want to be respectful of the fact that there are different jurisdictions with different resources, right? But the one thing I would really love to be able to see is how are people voting by what vote method? Like that would be great. Like what share of the people have mail ballots out, followed by how many people are voting on during your early voting period, so that we can start to estimate how many people might show up on election day. That really helps with our work and our planning. So I know that's not always the easiest thing to do. And if you are a smaller jurisdiction and you have a vendor who is helping you with, you know, setting up your systems or is responsible for some of the kind of back end stuff, asking them to create you button press ready reports that you can just click and that you have pressure tested to make sure the data in there is correct, and then just be able to post those on a website. That could really solve a lot of the things I'm asking for, and I think it would go a long way with a lot of different folks out there in the world too who are looking for this transparency around data.
All right, Jess.
Nick stole mine. I was actually going to say metadata and data dictionary because for me, those just so important. But one of the other things I guess I'll say is to not use your inbox as your archive, is to take that information and put it in a folder, because you're going to see over time and get the same requests over and over and over again. And so just having that look back, and that way you can start to compile that information election by election. And so if someone asks you, okay, well, what happened then and what happened then, easy to go back. And it might even incite some change in how you do the reporting.
All right. Andrew, your third thing.
Well, I'm just going to circle back and remind you of the other two, I think, is the fair way to do this, TJ, right? Which is we would love zero reports, right, as early as humanly possible to be posted, right, online. So whether, and just however you all plan on communicating information that day, right, like you letting us know in the place where you're going to communicate it ahead of time would be really helpful. And then my own like personal one is just timestamps. Just have everything have a timestamp so we know when it was updated, so that I can make sure that I am not misinterpreting something on my end. Yeah.
All right. Well, I thank each of you for taking the time to join this conversation. I hope everybody who was able to join us as a participant found this conversation as valuable as I did. I really enjoyed it. As always, if folks have questions, don't hesitate to reach out to support@readyfortuesday.com. And we look forward to hopefully seeing you for future conversations. Happy Election Day, Florida folks, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.